Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be discussing ancient Egypt. Often considered the beginning of recorded history, the Egyptian culture is key to our understanding of ancient communities. While enduring almost 5,000 years, the style of Egypt remained pretty consistent. It was incredibly influential, and the designs are still fairly popular today. In this lecture, we will discuss the Egyptian geography, culture, and architecture, as well as its lasting effect on societies. As I just mentioned, Egypt was an incredibly influential society. On this slide, you can note the lasting impact of the Egyptian style, specifically on Roman and Greek culture. These were also ancient societies whose religions were set up in a very similar manner to the Egyptians. Not only was there trade between the cultures, but there was also communication, which led to cultural influence. However, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Egyptian culture kind of died off due to the steep rise in the three major Judeo-Christian religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, most of these were focused on the rise of Christianity and later the rise of Islam. However, as excavations began and Egypt was rediscovered, the interest in the style rose all over again. Initially, many European colonists had ruined many of the existing relics of the Egyptians' legacy. However, they soon discovered the value of the objects, and leaders began to encourage archaeological excavations. There was a peak of interest in Egypt as archaeologists continued to uncover treasure after treasure from Egypt. Many excavations began with Napoleon. Napoleon brought several scientists and artists to document their finds in Egypt. The interest never really died down, and Egypt is still a heavily researched site now. However, there are many more councils that aim to protect these items, as they are some of the earliest in existence. You can read a little bit more about that on this slide. So, as you can see on this map here, Egypt is located on the African continent. It is up here in this northeast corner. It sits between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and it has the Nile running through it, so it has plenty of waterways to encourage trade. However, most of Egypt is still pretty arid. You can see near Libya, Chad, Algeria, all of that area accounts for the Sahara Desert, so it's a very, very dry climate, except for those areas where you do get water. So the Nile will be where most of the settlements occur, as that's really the only sustainable places for life, as everywhere else is just too dry for people to live. This map here is a little more zoomed in, so you can see the way that the Nile flowed through the area. Settlements were almost exclusively located in the valley around the river. And one thing to note when we're looking at this map, there are two main regions that we often hear about when discussing Egypt: Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. These are backwards from how we see them on the map, so Upper Egypt is actually inwards towards the main continent, and Lower Egypt is located up here by the Mediterranean. So, as you saw in the previous maps, Egypt is located in northeastern Africa, and it's in a very secure location. So you have those two seas, the Mediterranean and the Red, protecting it on two sides, and then desert surrounding it. So they weren't really prone to invasion in the same way that many of the other cultures that we will study were. However, it was also a dry climate, so if you were away from that Nile Valley, you didn't have access to drinking water, and it was really unsustainable. However, they did have the Nile, which is the world's longest river, and the Nile provided all of the water needed for drinking and irrigation. So the Nile Valley was a green oasis in the desert. It really offered them everything that they needed to survive. It also offered stones such as granite and basalt, and they relied on these for their architecture, which we will discuss later, as well as softer stones, which really allowed it to be an artistic inspiration. The Nile gave them everything they needed, and they were really grateful, and a lot of their religion is centered around that. So, when discussing the people of Egypt, it's important to remember that their religion was incredibly central to them. Their religion was pulled mostly from those natural processes, so their year was divided into 3 seasons: the flood time, the seed time, and the harvest time, all of which were centered around the Nile. So, all of their gods were pulled from those natural processes as a means of explanation because they didn't have the scientific discoveries that we know today. Um, However, their religion was so central to them, but they believed that it would extend long beyond their physical life. So they believed in life after death, they believed in preparing for an afterlife. Everything was about making it further down the road than their physical bodies would take them. They were polytheistic, so they had several gods, most of which were centered around resources. The creation myth is centered around the sun god Ra, who was relentless towards the people of Egypt. So he didn't feel as though he was being worshipped enough, so he used the sun as a means of punishment. So you'll actually notice that the probably most worshipped god is actually the goddess Isis, who showed a lot of mercy to the people of Egypt in providing the water and resources that they relied on. So she was definitely the most influential character in Greek mythology, so much so that she would actually be worshipped in several other cultures later, despite not actually being a god in the Roman and Greek religions. However, the people still had a very high reverence for her. Some other notes include that the people of higher echelons were preserved. We know this after the discovery of mummies, which were often found in the pyramids and mastabas. Generally speaking, the people were deemed to be pretty attractive. They kept incredible records, so they do have a writing system known as hieroglyphs, and researchers have spent years and years figuring that out, and we feel like we have a good understanding of that language now, so we can really understand all of their different records that they kept, which were very vast. They also had a lot of other knowledge. So we have knowledge about them, but they were a really advanced people. Despite not having the same access to the tools that we have, they were still making scientific leaps and bounds daily. This is an image that most of you probably recognize. This is the death mask of King Tut. According to Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, this mask is not only the quintessential image from Tutankhamun's tomb, it is perhaps the best known object from ancient Egypt itself. So after a long search beginning in 1915, Carter, who was an Egyptologist, discovered the actual tomb of Tutankhamun in November of 1922. And this was one of the major pieces that was found there. Most of the tombs had been looted, so while we do have a lot of what was left, there's not a complete tomb. However, this is probably one of the most complete that we've had. And it's really what made Tutankhamun famous. He wasn't a particularly long-lasting leader. He had a very short reign. He died incredibly young. But because we have so many objects from his house, because everything that the Egyptians owned, they took with them to the grave as a means of preparing for the afterlife. So this has left us with a lot of information about him, despite the fact that he probably wasn't this major leader in Egypt. The architecture of Egypt can be traced back to 3700 BCE, and it was quite monumental. So our book notes that the Egyptians' reverence for their gods and their god-related rulers fostered one of history's most ambitious building programs, including the construction of the pyramids, sphinxes, obelisk, and temples, some of which were stupendous in scale. And so they didn't actually have access to a ton of construction materials. They mostly had to use stones, tree trunks, or clay sun-dried bricks, which you'll notice a lot of in those great pyramids, which are incredibly famous. But because of how arid the climate was, with the exception of that very small strip of valley around the Nile, they didn't have access to a lot of wood, which obviously hurt their ability to construct things, as wood is one of the easiest building materials to use. But it is one of the main reasons why we still have that architecture today, because they weren't using a material that would fade away quickly. Those clay sun-dried bricks and the stone are incredibly long-lasting, which is important for them because remember, they were trying to build something that would last far beyond them. They were building not only for their life but for the afterlife, so they wanted it to be as long-lasting as possible, and it's a real testament to them that these are still standing today. This image here shows the Great Pyramid at Giza, so it is part of a larger religious complex. There are several pyramids around it, but this one is the largest and the most notable of these pyramids. So the pyramids at Giza were built relatively early in ancient Egypt, specifically during the Old Kingdom. Rulers, which were also known as pharaohs, came to be identified as living gods, and they commanded their people to construct these monumental building projects. So the pyramids at Giza were built specifically for 3 pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, and they were symbolic, but they were primarily there to protect the mummy. So as I mentioned, these pyramids were part of a greater religious complex. Smaller pyramids were built around this one for Khufu's wives, and the pyramid was a potent symbol of Khufu's power and assumed immortality. So the exterior was a shield for a very compact burial chamber. It was also built to protect them in the afterlife, so they believed that you have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive, and they wanted to make sure that each of these rulers had a path that was easiest to get to the afterlife. So, as mentioned earlier, the Egyptians relied on stone for their construction projects. Wood was incredibly scarce, so they weren't able to use that to build these monumental buildings. So they relied on stone for that. And this stone was transported up to 700 miles. They relied on the Nile to help get that from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt. So the idea of a wood tree trunk was converted to stone. So they wanted that wood look that you could see elsewhere in the world, but they didn't have that resource. So they often made their columns and such look as though they were made out of wood by adding some light carving to the stone that they used. They often used a tapered construction, which helped them support the top by making sure that there's enough weight on the bottom. A lot of those clay bricks would actually crush if you put too much weight on top of them. So using that tapered design helped to take the pressure off of some of those lower pieces, which is how we came up with this stepped pyramid look. Their designs were also monolithic, which is just something to take note of as you're looking at their architecture. On this slide, you see an image of a column that shows reading. This was one of the ways that they pulled that influence from those wooden tree trunks. It is a very stylized version of that, but that is what they were going for by adding those vertical lines to the columns. This image here shows a lesser known pyramid, but you can clearly see the stair-stepped construction because the material was those sun-dried bricks. So like I said, they kind of had to spread out the weight at the bottom and centralize it at the top as a means of not crushing those bricks. This is more impressive when you consider the lack of machinery. So they did use logs and such as wheels in a way, but they didn't have any of the help that we would use today to build a project this monumental. And then the pyramid is also symbolic. So the pyramid's angled sides symbolize the ray of the sun, and they were designed to help the king or Pharaoh's soul ascend into heaven and join the gods, specifically the sun god Ra. So it was intended to get you closer to the sun and closer to the gods. So the architecture of Egypt is often compared to the architecture of the Mayans, which were down in Central America, so Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala. They also had stepped pyramids, though theirs served a different purpose. They did still use them for burial, but not in the same way that the Egyptians did. It is important to note that the Mayan culture was significantly later than the Egyptians, but there was no communication between the two. So they were completely separate in developing their styles. However, the styles ended up being really similar. So this slide here just shows you some examples of the Mayan architecture, that stepped pyramid look. It is incredibly different, though it does still serve a lot of those same worshipful purposes while doing that in a different way, obviously, than the Egyptians did. They did have access to different materials, which could have something to do with the differences in looks. The Mayan one tends to be much steeper, suggesting that the stairs probably were able to hold their weight a little bit better than the Egyptians were with those sun-dried bricks. However, the Mayan architecture influence didn't die out. You can still see that throughout Mexico. Down on the bottom here, you can see an image of a contemporary building, which once again pulls influences from those ancient from those ancient buildings, and we'll also see that quite a bit as Egypt begins to be rediscovered throughout the world. So this is just another image of the Mayan pyramids. You can see in this one up close the stone building materials. They definitely had more gaps in there. They didn't really use a mortar. It was all about stacking these stones. This is another Mayan building. You can see, once again, the stone construction as well as a colonnade. This is a Mayan wall, so you can see how they stacked the stones, and they were able to stack them on top of one another. This specific example probably did use some mortar, which helped to make it a little bit stronger. In terms of actual construction, the Egyptians used an incredibly basic architectural system. So the post and lintel system, which relies on having two posts and a beam that goes across the top, is probably as rudimentary as you can get. However, it was the foundation for most of their buildings. So for then, since they were having to use such heavy materials with those stones, they did rely on those columns or the post being really close together to hold up that lintel weight. But in order to make this really basic system even more decorative, they often carved out motifs on them. Lots of ropes and stalks for the reading. They also had capitals, which were highlighted a lot of floral elements, which once again goes back to that influence of the Nile. And then the lintel, which was the beam that ran across the top, was also decorated, often with hieroglyphs telling some type of story. When they weren't using that post and lintel system, which allowed for all of their windows and doorways, they were usually just using stacked clay bricks or stones. This image here shows a mastaba, which is essentially the same thing as a pyramid, except it was built for those who were ranked slightly lower in society than the pharaohs, so still noblemen, but not quite as important. So you'll notice it doesn't have the same monument type look to it. It's not as tall, it doesn't come to a point. But this specific photo shows a really great image of that post and lintel system, so you can see all of those columns which have a lintel across the top. This slide shows the 3 types of Egyptian capitals. These are going to be important for your quiz and your test, so make sure you're taking notes. So the capital is that top part of the column, and on the left you can see that lotus bud capital with reading. And then on the right and the middle, you can see the two campaniform capitals, one of which, the one in the middle, has the just slight patterning around the bottom. However, that would have still been some type of floral motif. And then the one on the far right has the acanthus leaves on the top, which were really popular. Each of these capitals were influenced by the floral life that was possible because of the Nile. And they really wanted to decorate these columns because it did take so many of them to hold up the ceiling, since they had to use all of that stone. Here you can see some more drawings of the types of architectural capitals that were specific to the ancient Egyptian civilization. They would have actually been painted, so they would have been really colorful. Once again, focusing on nature and life, all of those things that the Nile River helped make sustainable about living in Egypt. So they wanted to focus on that, and so they used a lot of natural elements in their decoration. So back to those important architectural structures. Once again, their most important structures were their burial chambers. So those are the main two that we're going to look at. So you've got the pyramids and the mastabas. Both of these served as tombs. They were located near the Nile. However, the pyramids had a more processional approach, whereas the mastabas were often carved into the cliffs. They both had sort of decorative entrances, but the pyramids held more provisions for those life after death. So the pyramids, once again, were for the pharaohs, for the queens, and the mastabas were just for noblemen. So none of these were for commoners in the society. However, they do hold a lot of significance, and most of what we can learn about them is based from these structures, as these were the ones that are still standing. This image shows a section cut of a pyramid, so you can notice that for as monumental as these structures were, the actual burial chamber was incredibly small, which once again goes back to that idea of security. They wanted to make sure that people couldn't come in and raid the tombs. Obviously, eventually people did make their way in, so a lot of the stuff that was in most of these pyramids was lost, but there were almost these mazes throughout them, so you would have to take all of the right turns at all of the right places to actually get to the main burial chamber. So while those mazes, which were filled with a lot of valuable items, most of that was looted, we have found some of these tombs, while not completely intact, almost completely intact. This is a mastaba, which was once again for those noblemen. It was still highly decorative. It was still an important place to be buried, signifying their space in society. But as you can see here, rather than being a single structure that was freestanding, these were actually built into those cliff sides, so still very monumental, but they used that natural landscape around them to help them support this type of architecture. As I mentioned before, these pyramids are some of the oldest structures that we still have, and there are several reasons for that. So to start with, the construction material of granite is a very durable construction material, which is helped by the fact that it has a mild climate. So Egypt doesn't get a lot of rain, so the water can't really get to the stone as much to weather that away. It's built over a water table, and it is in a remote location. So most of the damage actually comes from those tomb robbers as well as the excavation. There is some erosion, but definitely not as bad as it would be in a more extreme climate. But the pyramid of Cheops, which is the same as the Pyramid of Khufu. The name has just been changed a couple of times as different people have discovered it. It is the last surviving structure of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So here you can see a list of those 7 wonders of the ancient world. Once again, those pyramids date back to being the earliest structures, but they are the most long-lasting. They are the only ones that can still be seen today, which goes back to those building materials that they used and all of the reasons that we saw in the previous slide. But one thing to note here is that all of these are from the same region of the world, generally speaking. They're in that kind of Middle East, Lower Europe, Upper Africa area, which is mostly because this was the region that was most sustainable to life before we had technology to move water from place to place. Here's just another map showing where those 7 wonders of the ancient world would have been found. Like I said, it's a pretty small region of the world where all of this was occurring, and most of our ancient societies were found in this area. Okay, so another major piece of architecture is the Great Sphinx. This is located in Giza, same as those pyramids. And a sphinx is a mystical monster with the body of a lion and the head of something else, so not all sphinxes are necessarily the same. This particular one has the face of the pharaoh Khafre, and the body of a lion. So the headdress is what we know signifies this to be a pharaoh, and it is theorized that this is built over a fault line, which causes an unusual body length, so it doesn't necessarily look in proportion with itself despite its monumental size, but it has a really central placement to protect the pyramids at Giza. This is an image of that Great Sphinx, so you can kind of see the body being a lion, but mostly you can see that face with the headdress, which shows that this is a pharaoh. Moving on to interiors, it's important to note that most of what we know about their interiors, we know from those burial chambers. So once again, they took everything that they could with them to the grave so that they would have it in the afterlife. So most of the surviving furniture that we have, or really any of that decoration, comes from these interiors of those burial chambers. In the interiors, they used a limestone, which is a much softer stone than the granite that would have been used on the outside of most of their structures. They used 2-dimensional human forms, so they have a lot of wall paintings as well as relief carvings, which is just a really light carving into the wall. It's not a sculpture that's in the round, which means it can be seen on all sides. So they would carve as well as paint their walls as a means of decoration. But all of their figures were really stylized. Once again, only in 2 dimensions. They're not realistic, but they get the point across. They used a lot of bright colors, each signifying different things. So here you can see that the red skin would typically signify a male, as well as yellow skin typically signifying a female. They would use hieroglyphs, which was their form of writing, to kind of tell what's going on in the image. The dado is similar to a wainscot, so it would come partway up the wall and it would be decorated as well. And then once again, they had those really close columns, so they had really heavy ceilings, and to hold that up, you definitely need more support, which obviously means that they're not going to have these grand open floor plans that we think of as being really revolutionary today, but they did use these columns closely together to make sure that everything could be held up and that they would have strong sculptures or structures that would last them for their lifetime and into eternity. This image here just shows one of those wall paintings, so you can see the really stylized figures. Men were drawn as taller than women as well, so you can see the hierarchy of scale, which means that more important figures are often drawn larger than smaller figures. But you can also see that they have hieroglyphs all around to kind of tell the story of what's happening in the image. So this is another image that would have been painted on the walls. This comes from one of those burial chambers, so from a tomb. and it shows a man, presumably the person who was buried, kneeling before Osiris, who was one of the Egyptian gods. He was the husband of Isis, so he was incredibly important as a figure of showing mercy to the Egyptian people. This image, also from a burial chamber, shows a hunting scene, and once again, this is probably one of our better examples of hierarchy of scale. So you notice that the hunter is larger than everything else around him, despite the fact that in general, a hunter would probably be smaller than some of the prey that he is going to go and hunt. So this just shows that he is the most important figure because he is the largest. And this is just one more image from a burial chamber. You can kind of see that dado along the bottom. This one's not as pronounced, but it is that difference between the main image up top and that wainscot area. These pictures here show images from the wall of the tomb of Queen Nefertari. She was the mother of King Tut. So you can see these have actually a woman at the center because she was the person being buried. So they show her rites of passage as she goes from the life that she has into the afterlife. This image here shows just how much of their wall was covered in decoration, but it also shows that dado, so that's going to be this part along the bottom where you see the repeated pattern. In modern terms, we would call this the wainscoting. This picture here shows the hieroglyphs that the Egyptians would have used. So rather than a series of letters like the English alphabet, they actually used images to depict their words. So it is much more tenuous than the English alphabet would be, but it definitely got their point across, and researchers have spent a long time going through and seeing which each of these pictures would have meant and what it would have depicted. And since they kept such diligent records, we've actually been able to discover a lot of them through the modern interpretation of their hieroglyphs. So we previously discussed the way that the Egyptians would have decorated the capitals of their columns, but they would have used hieroglyphs along the sides of their columns to depict the meaning of what was inside that building. So here you can see on this image hieroglyphs surrounding the columns that would have told some type of story, especially in their temples, about the god or goddess being worshipped. When looking at Egyptian furniture, most of it was pretty exclusive to the nobility. So while standard Egyptian houses probably would have had some furniture, it probably would have been built into the structure rather than able to be moved. The remaining examples that we have come from excavations, the most notable being that of King Tut's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter, which we kind of discussed earlier. Once again, they didn't have access to a lot of wood, which made all of their wood products incredibly expensive, which is why it was reserved for nobility and the pharaohs. Acacia wood would have been the most common type of wood used, but they would have relied on straw or wicker to make their seats and their mats rather than using wood for the whole piece because that wood was so rare. To dress it up, they did use a lot of inlays, whether that was ivory or stones or gold or silver. They used these inlays to really embellish their furniture. This image here is a photograph from Howard Carter's excavation of King Tut's pyramid. So you can see some of the furniture here, but most importantly, you can see just how much stuff was packed into these really small burial chambers as a means of taking as much as you possibly could so that your path to the afterlife would be easier. This image here shows a chair made of acacia wood with some golden accents. You can see the image on the back and the hieroglyphs, which once again would have told some type of story. It's also important to note that these chairs were kind of like thrones. So the most important person in the room would be the most elevated. Most people sat on mats or sat on the floor. Chairs were relatively rare and reserved once again for the most important person in the room. Outside of the nobility, furniture in Egypt was incredibly rare. You did see some chairs and stools, but most of that was reserved for the kings and queens, specifically those canopic chests, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. All of these furniture pieces had similar features, such as the animal legs and feet, pads below the feet. They had a concave seat, so it curves in, a reclined back, so it leaned back a little bit. It had hieroglyphs and symbols, which would have told some type of story or signified whose piece it was. So all of their stuff, once again, comes back to trying to tell some type of story. They didn't have anything in Egypt that didn't have a purpose to it, and their furniture is no different. On this image here, which is of a chair, you can see those animal legs and feet as well as the concave seat. And you can see that this was made of acacia wood, so it hasn't held up as great as it could, but thanks to that arid climate, we do still have it, whereas wood would have eroded away in other cultures because of their climate. This is a highly decorated chair made of that acacia wood, but it does have the inlaid materials, which is what's giving it those patterns and bright colors. It has the concave seat and the legs are in an X design, which is something that we see in a lot of folding chairs today. So once again, you can see the influence of Egypt on the modern world, and this idea of an X-style chair base is not going to go away. We're going to see that throughout history. So Egyptians relied on the following types of wood joinery, specifically that mortise and tenon joint, as well as the dovetail joint, the butt joint, the half joint, and the miter joint. Each of these are ways in which you can make the wood hold itself together, so they wouldn't have had the same access to glues or steel nails the way that we do today. Therefore, it was important when they were building with wood to find ways to get the wood to hold its own weight, and that's why they invented so many of these types of wood joinery, each of which can still be seen today. So these are incredibly influential construction techniques. So all of the Egyptian ornament came from that natural world around them. That's where their inspiration came from the Nile that provided so much life and made it possible to live in Egypt. So that's what you're going to see in a lot of their motifs, whether that is plant life or animal life. All of that's going to be seen in their ornament. They also have the diaper patterns, which are just your typical patterns, usually in a diamond shape that can be repeated really easily. They used bold colors, primarily those primary colors, so the red, blue, and yellow, as well as mixing in some charcoal and white. And then they used relief sculpture mostly, which means that it's being carved into a wall rather than in the round. In the round means that you can see it from 360 degrees, so no matter how you're looking at it, there is something carved into it. And they did have those, so I don't want to make it seem like they didn't have any in the round sculptures, but their focus was primarily on those relief sculptures, which can be seen in partnership with the incised carvings, which is going to have a lot of those hieroglyphs. And the reason that we still have those today is because they were so deeply carved into the wall, so that the weathering and erosion couldn't really knock them all the way out. You also see a cartouche pattern. This image here is of King Tut's throne chair, so you can see it has a lot of the precious metal inlays, so you see a lot of gold, as well as the back signifying whose chair it was. It had a photo, or not photo, but picture representation of him. This image here showcases the natural motifs, so you can see a lot of plant and animal life, which were incredibly common in Egyptian ornamentation. So this here shows those diaper patterns, which, like I said before, are mostly those diamond, very easily repeated over a large area patterns. These two images here show some of those in the round sculptures, so they are finished out on all sides. And these would have shown the likeness of a person, however stylized that may be. Especially for leaders, this was important as it gave them eyes to watch over the people even if they weren't in the room. These images here shows those canopic chests, which I told you earlier that we would talk about them later. So these actually held the organs that were removed from the leaders during the embalming process. So while they were being mummified, they actually removed all of the internal organs and put them in these boxes. Eventually, they would put them in jars and then put them into the boxes, but for most leaders, this is what held all of their earthly organs. In terms of the human forms, once again, these were incredibly stylized, so they weren't necessarily as realistic as a photograph would be or anything like that. They did lack perspective, and oftentimes things were actually shown in multiple perspectives, which is what leads to that stylized image. So you would notice that their face would be in profile while the rest of their body would be facing the front. And so that mixed perspective is often associated with Egyptian art. An important person would be enlarged. Once again, that concept is known as hierarchy of scale. Men were larger than females, mostly because they were more important to the Egyptian society. And then they had really stiff poses. So once again, there's not much natural movement. They don't look relaxed or anything like that. And then they would have forward-facing eyes in that side pose. So once again, just to reiterate, they had various perspectives in their drawings rather than having one single viewpoint. And then their ears were pierced. This image just shows you with the way that the person's shoulders are facing towards us and their face is facing towards the side, but their eyes are still pointing forward, that various use of perspective. As I have mentioned before, there was nothing in the Egyptian society that did not hold meaning, and that can be associated with their motifs too. So the lotus often symbolized purity, while the vulture symbolized protection. The sun was relative to the sun god, the cobra symbolized the pharaoh, and the scarab symbolized life. This is an image of the lotus blossom, which once again represented purity and was the inspiration for a lot of Egyptian art and can be seen on many of their columns. This image here shows motifs of the sun for the sun god, as well as the cobra representing the pharaoh. Once again, you can see that these are heavily stylized, but the Egyptians definitely would have known their meaning. While today we would often view the vulture in a negative light, for the Egyptians it symbolized protection. So it was really important because, once again, they believed that the journey to the afterlife was going to be incredibly hard. So having that protection there with them would help ensure that they would have an easy journey to get to the afterlife. This image here shows a necklace with that lotus blossom motif, which once again would have symbolized purity. This is an image, once again, of King Tut's headdress, which we discussed earlier, but this time notice that cobra on the head, which would have signified that he was a pharaoh. While the Egyptians did not have a lot of furniture necessarily, they did have several accessories. one of which being a neck rest, which would have served as a pillow of sorts. They didn't have a ton of textiles, so if they did have any pillows, they would have been scarce, but the neck rest helped to support their neck while they slept. They would also have jars and jewelry, as well as elaborate headdresses. Here you can see one of those neck rests. So like I said, this would have served as a pillow supporting their head while they slept. I can't imagine that it would have been incredibly comfortable, as it was made out of alabaster, which is a relatively hard substance in comparison to what we would think of for a pillow, but it did serve useful to them. This image here shows an unguent jar made from alabaster. So alabaster is easily carved and often used for vessels. It's generally a white or a pale brown. So they would have used this just to carry water or wine or any type of substance like that. This is another one of those unguent jars, so you can see they had a lot of different styles and options for these. They didn't all look the same. However, they all had those natural motifs connected to them. This is a pectoral necklace. As you can see, it's highly decorative, which would have shown the status of a person. So generally it would have been pharaohs and noblemen that would have had access to these really ornate materials to make these necklaces. I have mentioned several times that Egypt was an incredibly influential society, and part of that, they had really good sailors, so being surrounded by so much water helped them to get their influence to other parts of the world. So like I said, while the Romans and Greeks didn't actually adopt the Egyptian religion, they still had a really high reverence for the goddess Isis, because the Egyptians were able to get the word out. So being able to sail and navigate the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea helped them to spread their influence. Furthermore, they had artistic influence on several other cultures, especially upon excavation and rediscovery of those Egyptian tombs. A lot of the furniture and building design of the 1920s can be directly related back to that discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And we still see that influence today. So a lot of that Art Deco style that was popular in the 20s and is kind of coming back through our tiles today has its real influence from Egypt. This image here shows a modern recreation of an Egyptian stool, so you can see those animal feet as well as the animal heads on the side. This one does have a cushion added, so it's probably much more comfortable than the standard Egyptian stools. This is an elevator door, which shows that modern influence of Egyptian design, so you can still see that really stylized motif, but it all comes back to that lotus flower. This is a modern home, but you can see on that column, as well as in some of the colors and images used, that this was heavily influenced by Egypt. So some quick notes on the review. Just make sure that you know those different types of columns, as well as the monumental architecture, as well as the true influence of their religion. So remember, it impacted every part of their life, and you should be able to relate that to the different motifs and elements that we have seen. You can save this sheet here. It goes over a lot of the things that we went over today, and I think it will help you as you're doing your work for this module. So have a great rest of your day and good luck going through the rest of this module.